Hey everyone, I noticed a lot of you who are watching and enjoying the content aren't subscribed yet. If you love spine-chilling stories, creepy encounters, and unexplained mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the next terrifying upload. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more of the content you love. It was supposed to be simple: meet a new guy, have dinner, and see if we hit it off. That's all. I wasn't expecting fireworks, but I was open to the possibility of something real. But from the very beginning, there was something about the night that felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but looking back now, the signs were all there. We had met a couple of weeks before on a dating app. His name was Tom, and he seemed completely normal, or at least as normal as anyone on those apps can seem. He was attractive in a wholesome boy-next-door way. His profile was filled with clever jokes, and he seemed genuinely interested in the things I liked. When we started chatting, we clicked right away. Tom was funny, attentive, and charming in a way that felt refreshingly genuine. After just a few days of texting back and forth, he asked me out to dinner. He suggested a nice restaurant downtown and promised to take care of all the details. When he offered to pick me up, I hesitated for a moment. A tiny voice in the back of my mind reminded me about the countless warnings to never let someone you've just met online know where you live. But he seemed harmless. Besides, it was just a first date in a public place. The afternoon of our date, I texted Tom my address. I reasoned with myself, what could possibly go wrong? I spent the next few hours getting ready, picking out a cute outfit and applying just enough makeup to look like I wasn't trying too hard. Right on time, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, there he was, handsome, well-dressed, and holding a bouquet of flowers. He looked exactly like his photos, which was a relief in itself. He smiled warmly as he handed me the bouquet. "These are for you," he said. It was a sweet gesture, and I felt myself relax a little. As we walked to his car, I noticed something odd. He didn't hesitate or ask if he was at the right house. He walked straight to my door, as if he had been there before. My stomach did a little flip, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just confident, or had memorized my address from the map app. At the restaurant, things started off great. Tom was just as funny and charming in person as he had been online. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and I found myself laughing more than I had in weeks. But as the night went on, small things began to feel strange. He made a comment about a coffee shop I liked to visit, which I didn't remember mentioning to him. Then, he referenced an obscure book I had read years ago, something I was certain I hadn't brought up. At first, I thought maybe I had told him these things during our online chats and simply forgotten. But the more specific his comments became, the more uneasy I felt. The tipping point came on the drive back to my place. I had to know. "How did you know exactly where I lived?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Have you been there before?" For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then a slow, almost amused smile spread across his face. "I have been there before," he said calmly. My heart started pounding. I felt the blood drain from my face. "What do you mean?" I demanded. That's when he told me everything. Tom admitted that he had been watching me for weeks. He had found my social media profiles, tracked my check-ins, and figured out my daily routines. He knew where I worked, the route I took walking my dog, and even the time I usually left for my morning run. He described following me to the grocery store, sitting in his car outside my favorite coffee shop, and even driving past my house late at night. "I just wanted to get to know you better," he said, as if that somehow made it okay. I sat frozen in my seat, a sick feeling rising in my stomach. This man I thought I had just met had been stalking me, learning every detail about my life without my consent. When we pulled up to my house, I didn't wait for the car to stop fully before I jumped out. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my keys, desperate to get inside and lock the door behind me. I didn't look back. Once inside, I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. I felt violated in a way I couldn't fully describe. My home, my routines, my sense of safety, all of it had been invaded by someone I had trusted enough to let into my life. I debated whether to call the police. What would I even say? Part of me worried they wouldn't take me seriously since I had willingly gone on a date with him. But another part of me knew I couldn't just let this go. I had to do something. In the days that followed, I became hypervigilant. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if Tom was still out there, watching me. I avoided my usual coffee shop, took a different route to work, and even started staying at a friend's house on the weekends. I never heard from Tom again after that night. His profile on the dating app was gone, and his number no longer worked. For a while, I tried convincing myself that maybe he wasn't as dangerous as I feared. that maybe he was just a lonely guy who had taken things too far. But the fear lingered. Every creak of the floorboards in my house made me jump. Every shadow outside my window sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. Looking back, there were so many red flags I ignored. The way he seemed to know my address without hesitation, the overly specific comments about my life. But Tom had been so charming and normal on the surface that I had let my guard down. I learned the hard way that you never really know someone until you meet them in person, and even then, you might not see the truth until it's too late. Now, first dates terrify me no matter how normal the guy seems. I'm much more cautious about sharing personal details with strangers, even those who seem kind and genuine. My safety depends on staying vigilant and trusting my instincts when something feels off. Sometimes I still find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see Tom lurking in the shadows. The thought sends chills down my spine. This man I thought I was meeting for the first time had been living in my world for weeks without my knowledge. If there's one thing I've taken from this nightmare, it's the importance of listening to that little voice inside that tells you when something isn't right. The subtle signs are always there. You just have to pay attention. I share my story not to scare people, but to remind them to be cautious. Online dating can be exciting and fun, but it also opens the door to people with hidden agendas. Always trust your instincts and never ignore the red flags, no matter how small they might seem. Looking back, I wish I could go back and warn myself, but all I can do now is move forward and make sure no one else falls into the same trap. The world is full of good people, but it only takes one person like Tom to turn your life. I still remember that sunny Saturday when I met Mark for coffee. We had matched on a dating app and he seemed nice enough in our messages. He was cute in his photos, with warm brown eyes and dimpled cheeks when he smiled. At the coffee shop, we hit it off right away. The conversation flowed easily as we discovered we had similar tastes in music, movies, and hobbies. After an hour or so, we parted ways with a friendly hug. When Mark asked if he could see me again, I hesitated. I wasn't feeling that spark, so I politely told him I'd had a nice time, but didn't think we were a romantic match. He looked disappointed, but said he understood and wished me well. I left feeling like it had been an overall good first date, even if we weren't right for each other. The next day, I headed downtown to run some errands. As I was waiting to cross the street, I noticed a man standing a few feet away. He looked familiar. When he turned, I realized with a start it was Mark. Taken aback, I gave an awkward wave. "Hey, funny seeing you here," I said, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, what a coincidence," Mark replied with a smile. The light changed, and I hurried across the street, unsettled by the unplanned encounter. I tried to shrug it off, but over the next week, I kept seeing Mark everywhere. He'd be in line behind me at the grocery store, or passing me on the sidewalk as I walked to work. Once I spotted him sitting alone 2 tables away at my favorite cafe. Each time, he'd give me that same smile and a little wave. My discomfort grew. The final straw came when I saw him waiting outside my office building one evening as I left work. I walked up to him, my unease turning to anger. "Are you following me?" I demanded. "This can't be a coincidence anymore." Mark's smile faded. No, it's not like that," he insisted. "It's just fate bringing us together. Don't you see? We're meant to be." His earnest expression chilled me. I told him bluntly there was no meant to be. We barely knew each other. I asked him to please leave me alone and stop showing up places I frequented. For a moment his face darkened, but he quickly composed himself. "I understand," he said smoothly. "I just can't give up hope on us, but I'll respect your wishes." I watched warily as he walked away down the block. His response unsettled me further. I started taking different routes and changing my usual routines to avoid running into him again. Weeks went by without a sighting and I began to relax. Then one night, getting home late from dinner with a friend, I noticed a car parked across from my apartment. The driver's side was shrouded in shadow, but as I paused under the streetlight, the interior lit up enough for me to see Mark's familiar face watching me from behind the wheel. My heart pounding, I raced upstairs. I pressed the extra deadbolt on my door and sank to the floor, trying to calm my shaking hands. This had gone too far. A man I barely knew was clearly obsessed with me for reasons I didn't understand. The next day I went to the police and asked what could be done. They said stalking laws meant they couldn't intervene unless he directly threatened me. I felt helpless and afraid in my own home. I realized I would have to take action myself. I needed to find a new place Mark didn't know about. I confided in close friends, gave my workplace security a photo of Mark, and made plans to move as soon as possible. For weeks I lived on edge, terrified each time I stepped outside that I would find him lying in wait. I hardly slept, jolting awake at every small sound. I stopped going out alone, even in broad daylight. I felt like a prisoner in my own life. Mark continued showing up unexpectedly, lurking across the street, appearing in a grocery aisle, sitting at the back of a cafe, each time that friendly smile masking something more sinister beneath the surface. He never made contact or did anything overtly threatening, but his persistent presence was harassment in itself. My friends wanted me to get a restraining order, but the police said I didn't have enough evidence of threatening behavior. Mark was clever enough not to cross a legal line, while still inserting himself into the edges of my life as a constant, unsettling reminder. Living constantly on high alert took a toll on my mental health. I was anxious, sleep-deprived, paranoid. I felt violated and powerless, despite locking myself away inside. I considered changing my name or disappearing off the grid, but I refused to let Mark's harassment rob me completely of my identity and freedom. Finally, after months of stalking, the day came when I was able to pack my belongings into a truck bound for a new city and a fresh start. I only told my closest friend where I was going, not even family members, in case Mark tried to manipulate them into revealing my location. As the truck pulled away, I felt an immense sense of relief. I was reclaiming my life. Still, it took a long time before I stopped glancing over my shoulder everywhere I went, half expecting to see Mark's smiling face. For over a year after my move, every time an unknown number called, a jolt of fear went through me that it might be him. Slowly, the panic attacks and nightmares decreased, but I never regained the open, trusting attitude I'd had before. I was warier, more guarded with strangers. I hated that Mark had instilled that lasting wariness in me. For a long time, I avoided dating, fearful of encountering another predator behind a nice facade. Even now, years later, remnants of the stigma and shame resurface whenever I share my stalking story. Mark's harassment changed me at a core level. That sunny coffee date haunts me still, a reminder that you truly never know what darkness someone hides behind an appealing exterior. I often wonder if he's still out there searching for me, convinced we're fated to be together no matter how desperately I try to break. I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, at least I didn't used to, but after that night I'm not so sure anymore. It started out as just a regular first date. I had matched with this cute girl named Amy on a dating app and we decided to meet up for drinks. She picked a trendy little bar downtown called Murphy's that I had never been to. I arrived a few minutes early to secure a booth and watched as Amy walked in right on time. She looked just like her photos, shoulder-length brown hair, bright green eyes, and a warm smile that lit up the room. We hit it off instantly, chatting comfortably about our jobs, pets we had growing up, favorite TV shows to binge watch. The conversation flowed easily and I felt that spark you hope for on a promising first date. About 15 minutes in, though, I noticed Amy glance repeatedly over my shoulder, her eyes widening slightly each time. She would quickly look back at me and continue our conversation, but I could sense a nervous energy simmering beneath the surface. I finally asked if everything was okay. She hesitated, clearly debating whether to confide in me. "This is going to sound really strange," she began, "but ever since we got here, I've had this feeling that someone is staring at us. Out of the corner of my eye, I keep seeing a dark figure standing near the bar just watching us." I casually turned to look behind me, though I expected the area to be empty. Sure enough, there was no one there. Just a few vacant bar stools and empty tables. The restaurant wasn't very busy for a Thursday night. I scanned the room again just to be thorough, but didn't notice anyone who even remotely looked our way. "That's odd. I don't see anyone," I told her. She nodded uncertainly and took a sip of her drink. Her eyes were still troubled, though, flickering around the room when she thought I wasn't paying attention. We attempted to continue our conversation, but Amy was growing increasingly distracted. She kept furtively glancing over my shoulder, her shoulders tensing up every few minutes. She tried to hide it, but I could tell she felt very unsettled. Hoping to ease her discomfort, I suggested we head outside for some fresh air. Maybe that would help calm her nerves or shake off the strange vibes. She quickly agreed, and we gathered our things to leave. The cool night breeze felt refreshing after the stuffy bar. We strolled leisurely down the sidewalk, no real destination in mind. Amy seemed to relax a bit, even laughing at a dumb joke I made. After walking a few blocks in comfortable silence, I was starting to think the worst was behind us. But then I noticed her whole body suddenly stiffen. She stopped abruptly and whispered, "Do you hear that?" I paused and strained my ears, but detected nothing unusual. Only the normal sounds of the city at night, distant traffic, our footsteps on the pavement, leaves rustling in the trees overhead. "I hear footsteps, like someone is following right behind us," she added shakily. I immediately spun around, fully expecting to confront whoever had been stalking us all night. But again, no one was there. The sidewalk was completely empty and quiet. Amy was growing more hysterical by the minute. I suggested we head back to the bar, where there would at least be other people around. Safety in numbers, right? She clutched my arm tightly the whole way back, constantly glancing behind as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. But each time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing. No lurking figure, no pattering footsteps except our own. Just vacant streets and passing cars. We finally made it back to Murphy's and I walked Amy to her car, hoping the familiar setting would provide some comfort after the bizarre experience. As I gave her a gentle hug goodbye, I took one last look around the parking lot. Nothing seemed amiss in the glow of the street lamps, yet I couldn't shake the ominous feeling that invisible eyes were watching us. I never heard from Amy again after that night, and I can't say I blame her. Our date had been utterly derailed by her paranoia or overactive imagination. Or was it? What if she did see something I simply couldn't? Feel a presence lurking just beyond my senses? The rational part of my brain scoffs at the idea of ghosts or stalker spirits. It must have been a trick of the eyes, reflection in a window, mere coincidence magnified by her anxieties. But another part of me lingers on the sincerity of her fear, the goosebumps that prickled my own neck that night. And I wonder if the unseen watcher ever truly left us alone on that darkened street. If maybe the supernatural is closer than any of us want to believe. The experience certainly reshaped my own beliefs. I still consider myself a rational skeptic, but let's just say I'm less quick to dismiss the paranormal these days. Whether ghosts walk among us or not, the unseen world remains full of mystery. There are things in this life that defy easy explanation or belief, and our first dates sometimes venture down stranger paths than we ever imagined. It was just another regular Friday night when I met her. I had stopped by my favorite little Italian place to grab a bite to eat after work. I sat down at the bar and ordered my usual chicken parm with a side salad. That's when she walked in, a cute brunette wearing a flowy skirt and crop top. She sat down 2 seats away from me and ordered a glass of white wine. I tried not to stare, but couldn't help glancing over at her every so often. She had a girl next door kind of look that I found attractive. After she received her wine, she looked over and smiled at me. "I love this place. The food is so good here," she said. I smiled back and agreed, making some small talk about the great garlic knots and decent happy hour prices. Her name was Amanda, and she had just moved to the area for a new job. She was still getting familiar with the neighborhood restaurants and bars. We ended up chatting for over an hour, long after I had finished eating my meal. The conversation flowed easily, and I was pleasantly surprised by how comfortable I felt with her. She was cute, funny, and seemed very sweet. When she asked if I wanted to go out sometime, I didn't hesitate to say yes. We exchanged numbers and made plans for the following night. I picked her up on Saturday evening and we decided to grab drinks at a bar downtown. The date was going well, but something felt a little off. As we talked, she would randomly ask questions like, "Do you live by yourself?" and "What street do you live on?" At first I shrugged it off, but the more she questioned me about my personal life, the more uneasy I felt. We had a couple drinks and some appetizers before calling it a night. When we said goodbye, she gave me a tight hug and said, "I can't wait to see you again soon." I smiled politely, but a part of me felt relieved that the night was over. Her clinginess and personal questions had put me on edge. I tried to shake off the weird vibes as I drove home, but when I walked up to my front door, my stomach dropped. There were clear signs of an attempted break-in, scratches around the lock and imprints on the doorframe. My heart started racing. Had Amanda done this after I left the bar? Was this what all those personal questions were about? I rushed inside to make sure everything was okay. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I couldn't shake the nervous, uneasy feeling. Why had she been asking so many specific questions about my routine and where I lived? Was she trying to get information so she could break in? The next day, I tried to call Amanda to ask her about the date, but the number she had given me was disconnected. Her dating profile had been taken down too. She had completely vanished. I still think back to that night with a mix of confusion and fear. I'm honestly not sure what would have happened if Amanda had succeeded in breaking into my home. Maybe she just had an innocent interest in getting to know me. But my gut says her intentions that night were far more sinister. Now I'm much more cautious about what details I share on first dates. You just never know who someone really is or what they might be plotting. My close call with Amanda definitely left me rattled and much more alert about protecting my personal information. What seemed like an innocent date at first turned into something that felt dangerous and frightening. I'm just grateful that she wasn't able to follow through with whatever she had actually planned for that night. After that experience, I took a break from dating for a few months. I was wary of meeting someone new after what had happened. But eventually I decided to give it another try, albeit more cautiously. I expanded my social circle first, getting to know more people through work events and friends of friends. That way, if I did meet someone online to date, I could do some vetting ahead of time. A few times friends were able to say, "Oh yeah, I know that person," or "You may want to avoid that." It gave me an added layer of protection. When I did start dating again, I made sure to take things slowly when meeting someone new. I kept details about where I lived or my work schedule vague in the beginning. If anyone asked prying questions right off the bat, that was a major red flag for me to cut contact. I also started meeting dates only in public places, rather than picking them up or allowing them to come to my home. That provided a buffer if I got any kind of suspicious vibe during the evening. I could easily leave the restaurant or bar and get to a safe location. The experience with Amanda was definitely a wake-up call about personal safety. Especially meeting someone online, you just have no idea who that person really is outside of their profile. My lapse in caution that night could have ended so much worse. I'm grateful I escaped unharmed, but learned some tough lessons. While I don't want that one bad experience to make me paranoid or afraid to try dating again, I now take precautions to protect my privacy and safety. Making smarter decisions has helped relieve some of those initial anxieties about putting myself out there. And thankfully, the handful of women I've met since seem perfectly lovely and normal. I know you can't live life in fear or assume the worst in people, but some simple boundaries and vetting goes a long way towards weeding out shady characters. My friends like to tease me for being so safety conscious on dates now, but I know they're looking out for me too, and I feel much better going into a first date knowing I have backups and an exit plan if needed. Maybe I'm a little wiser and warier than before, but I think that caution has value, especially when meeting someone new. At least now if I see any red flags, I won't ignore them. My gut knows when something feels off, and I listen to it. Never again will I give personal details freely without really knowing who I'm dealing with. I still get chills when I think back to that eerie night. It was our first date after matching online, and I was running late as usual. My roommate told me I was crazy to meet a stranger from the internet, but I laughed it off. What could go wrong at a busy restaurant on a Saturday night? I rushed into the cozy Italian place, scanning the tables for my mystery man. He said he'd be wearing a blue shirt, and sure enough, there was a cute guy sitting alone in a booth. Navy top popped against the red leather seats. He flashed me a warm smile as I slid in across from him, apologizing for my tardiness. He said not to worry, the conversation flowed easily. He was just as charming and funny as he'd seemed in our messages. The waiter came by and we ordered a bottle of wine and some appetizers while we looked over the menu. We continued chatting effortlessly over pasta and wine once the main course arrived. I was amazed at how comfortable I felt, considering this was our first date with someone I'd met online. After about an hour, I needed to freshen up. I told my date I'd be right back and made my way to the restroom, giddy over how well things were going. I took my time, carefully reapplying lipstick and fluffing my hair, smiling to myself in the mirror. I was definitely getting ahead of myself, but I couldn't help daydreaming about future dates with this great guy. He was handsome, charming, and we seemed to have so much in common. I floated back to the table, ready to pick up where our lively discussion had left off, but as I approached our cozy booth, my heart sank. It was empty. Confused, I scanned the busy restaurant. No sign of that navy blue shirt or warm smile that had greeted me earlier. Had he stepped outside to take a call, maybe? Just as I pulled out my phone to text him, the waiter appeared with the check. "Sorry, your date said he had to leave suddenly. He asked me to give this to you and paid for both meals." "Did he say why he left? Is everything okay?" I asked, utterly perplexed. The waiter shook his head apologetically. No explanation, he just rushed out. I felt woozy, struggling to make sense of the bizarre situation unfolding. How could my date have just vanished into thin air right in the middle of dinner? I decided to check the restroom in case he was ill, but it was empty. I stopped another server, asking if she'd seen the man I was with leave. She gave me a puzzled look, insisting she hadn't seen anyone matching that description come or go all night. Thoroughly disturbed, I paid the remainder of the bill and decided to call him, demanding an explanation for his sudden disappearance. But his number was disconnected. Hands shaking, I quickly logged into the dating app we'd met on, but his profile had been completely deleted. It was as if he'd never existed. I barely slept that night, racking my brain for any rational explanation. Had our date gotten cold feet and left? Was he secretly married or something, and his wife caught him out? None of the theories made any logical sense, especially the staff all swearing they had no memory of him being there at all. In the harsh clarity of day, I started questioning everything. Had I imagined him? Hallucinated the entire lovely date in some sort of break from reality? But then who had paid for dinner and when? As the days passed with absolutely no trace of his existence, I grew more and more troubled. I knew deep down this charming guy had been very real. I'd felt a genuine connection. He'd been sitting across from me in that red leather booth, and then he'd vanished right before my eyes like a ghost. Weeks later, I still shudder when I think of that surreal night. I avoid that restaurant now, the scene of the inexplicable crime. Every time I pass by, I feel my heart race remembering that empty booth. Part of me wonders if I'll ever learn the truth about what really happened, if it was some elaborate prank or he was leading a dangerous double life. If I'll turn a corner and see that navy blue shirt and warm smile again someday, and finally get the explanation I deserve. The rational part of my brain knows it's highly unlikely I'll ever see him again, or understand what caused his abrupt disappearance. But there will always be a nagging ache, the lingering chill of being left alone so suddenly with nothing but questions swirling. Whoever he was, real or imagined, he left a haunting impression, and stole a tiny piece of my trust that night, like a phantom vanishing without a trace into the darkness. I try not to let the experience make me bitter or jaded. I still believe there are good, genuine people out there looking for love, but I am more cautious now about blindly trusting strangers, especially from the internet. That vanishing act on our first date left a permanent mark on me, even if it remains a mystery. Wherever that charming guy in the navy blue shirt came from, wherever he disappeared to, he took a little of my innocence with him that night, and left behind a lingering wariness in this wide-eyed romantic, a shadow of doubt where unbridled optimism used to be. I was so excited for my first date with Jake. We'd been chatting online for weeks and he seemed like such a great guy. Smart, funny, and super cute in his photos. We agreed to meet at a trendy new restaurant downtown. The date started off amazing. Jake was even more charming in person. We laughed and talked for hours over dinner and drinks. I felt like I'd known him forever. Before I knew it, it was nearly midnight. Jake offered to drive me home since I'd taken an Uber there. I happily accepted, not wanting the night to end. As we got in his car, Jake suggested taking a scenic detour to show me this cool spot he knew of. I was having such a great time that I agreed without hesitation. At first we were just driving through quieter residential streets, but soon the houses became more sparse, the streetlights fewer and farther between. An uneasy feeling started to creep in. We seemed to be heading out of the city entirely. I casually asked how much further this place was. Jake mumbled something vague about it being just up ahead. His tone had changed. He wasn't as warm and engaging anymore. The houses disappeared completely. We were on a dark, winding road with dense forest on both sides. No other cars in sight. My heart started racing. This didn't feel right at all. I told Jake I was getting tired and asked if we could head back now. He ignored me and sped up instead. Panic set in as I realized the danger I was in. How could I have been so stupid? I didn't really know this guy at all. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I try to grab the wheel? Jump out of the moving car? I had no idea where we were or how to get help. I noticed Jake kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Was he worried someone was following us? Or making sure no one would see what he was about to do to me? My imagination went to horrible places. I felt utterly trapped and helpless. Just then I remembered the pepper spray keychain in my purse. If I could get my hands on it without Jake noticing, maybe I'd have a chance. I casually reached for my purse on the floor, trying not to alert Jake. My fingers frantically searched for the small canister. Jake's eyes were fixed on the road ahead. We were going so fast now, taking sharp turns. The tires squealed. I gripped the pepper spray tightly, my thumb on the trigger. I had to time this perfectly. Suddenly, Jake slammed on the brakes. We screeched to a stop in a small clearing. This was my chance. As Jake turned towards me, I unleashed the pepper spray directly in his face. He howled in pain, completely disoriented. I flung open the door and ran as fast as I could into the woods. Branches whipped my face as I sprinted blindly through the darkness. I could hear Jake yelling and crashing through the trees behind me. Pure adrenaline propelled me forward. After what felt like hours, I finally saw lights in the distance. I emerged from the forest onto a main road. A gas station glowed like a beacon of hope. I burst through the doors, sobbing and begging the startled clerk to call the police. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and hospital examinations. I was physically okay, just some cuts and bruises from running through the woods. But I knew the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. They never caught Jake. His online profile was fake. The car he'd been driving was stolen. I tormented myself thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't acted when I did. The police said I was lucky to have escaped. It's been months now, but I still have nightmares about that night. I'm in therapy, trying to work through the trauma and learn to trust again. But it's a slow process. I'm much more cautious now. No more online dating for me. And I always carry pepper spray, just in case. I know not every first date will turn into a horror story like mine did. But I hope sharing my experience will remind others to be careful. Trust your instincts. Have an exit plan. Let friends know where you're going. It's better to seem paranoid than to end up in real danger. Looking back, there were red flags I ignored. Jake was a little too perfect online. He pushed to meet in person very quickly. During the date, he pressured me to drink more than I was comfortable with. I should have listened to that little voice telling me something was off. I'm gradually regaining my confidence and independence. But I'll never forget how quickly a dream date turned into a nightmare. I'm just thankful I made it out alive to tell my story and hopefully help others stay safe. It was my first date with Brad. We had matched online a few weeks prior and had been chatting regularly. He seemed nice, friendly, thoughtful, and we shared a lot of the same interests. When he suggested meeting up for dinner at his place, I didn't think much of it at the time. I'm not usually one to go to a stranger's home on a first date, but he had been so normal over text that I agreed. I arrived at his apartment around 7 p.m. on that fateful Friday night. When Brad welcomed me in, I immediately noticed the decor was a bit odd. The walls of his living room and dining room were completely covered in framed photographs, hundreds of them. They were all portraits of different people, men and women of various ages and ethnicities. I jokingly asked him if he had a hobby of collecting headshots. He laughed nervously and mumbled something about capturing humanity. Strange, but nothing too alarming yet. We sat down for the pasta dinner Brad had prepared. As we ate, I couldn't help but keep glancing at the walls of photos surrounding us. Though the portraits were varied, they seemed eerily familiar. I chalked it up to coincidence at first, but gradually realized these weren't random people. They were all residents from my own neighborhood. I recognized the local barista, my next-door neighbor, the crossing guard from down the street. My heart started racing. How were there so many photos of people who lived on my block? Trying to stay calm, I casually asked Brad about his photography. He got evasive and started rambling about having a passion for loving people from a distance. I knew I had to get out of there. I fake smiled through the rest of dinner, making an excuse to leave as soon as possible. Brad protested, insisting I stay for dessert and coffee. But I stood firm, grabbed my things, and hightailed it out of that creepy apartment. I spent the remainder of that evening peeking out my windows nervously, worried Brad had followed me home. I avoided my usual neighborhood spots for weeks afterwards, paranoid I'd run into him stalking around with his camera. Even now, years later, I get anxious walking past strangers, wondering if they'll end up framed on some obsessed guy's wall. After that unnerving experience, I vowed to never again ignore red flags or compromise my safety for politeness. Brad seemed so normal online, but turned out to be a true creep. I'll never forget those haunting walls of photos from my own neighborhood at that first date from hell. In hindsight, there were a few concerning signs about Brad even before we met up. When we first matched online, he was very quick to ask me personal questions, where I lived, my work address, if I had roommates. At the time, I shrugged it off as him just being curious, but it should have been an early red flag. When Brad suggested meeting at his apartment for our first date, that should have also been a warning sign. But after weeks of harmless conversation online, I wrongly assumed he was normal and well-intentioned. I told myself a home-cooked meal sounded cozier than going to some crowded restaurant. Looking back, I should have listened to my gut instinct and insisted we meet in a public place first. But I ignored those warnings, not wanting to hurt his feelings or seem difficult. If I could do it over, I never would have agreed to go to a practical stranger's home on a first date. I also should have gotten out of there sooner once the photo walls raised alarms. As soon as I realized those portraits were of my own neighbors, every hair stood up on the back of my neck. But I stayed polite and calm, not wanting to cause a scene or make Brad angry. I kept up a friendly charade through the rest of dinner, doubting my own instincts. If I could do it again, I would have fled the apartment right away, rather than stay in such a creepy, uncertain situation. After that horrible date, I wised up and took better precautions. I listen to my intuition more if someone seems off or untrustworthy. I always insist on meeting potential dates in a public place first. I tell a friend where I'm going and check in with them later, and at the first sign of a red flag, I am out of there. No excuses. I will never again doubt myself or stay in an uncomfortable or scary situation just to avoid rudeness. Saving face is not worth the risk. That chilling night was a harsh lesson, but I am grateful it was only photos and not something worse. Since then, I've shared my story to help others avoid similar bad judgment calls. But I still hate to imagine what Brad did with those photos of me, my neighbors, and who knows how many others. Where are those pictures now? Does he still stalk the neighborhood with his camera? It makes my skin crawl. I avoided online dating for a long time after that creepy incident. Even years later, when I finally tried it again, I was filled with anxiety. What if another seemingly nice match turned out to be disturbed? I remained fiercely vigilant about any possible red flags. Eventually, I regained some trust through a healthy relationship with someone normal. But I'll never forget that first online date gone horribly wrong. Brad and his wall of photos will always haunt me. A chilling reminder that monsters can hide behind friendly online personas. Trust your instincts, put safety first, and don't ignore any creepy red flags. That's the hard lesson I learned. No more chances or benefit of the doubt for potential stalkers and creeps. I'm just thankful I escaped relatively unscathed, when being polite could have cost me so much more. I had met Sasha online a few weeks prior, and we really hit it off over messaging. Her profile pictures showed a petite, shy-looking brunette with a cute smile. She seemed sweet in our conversations, if a little reticent. When I asked her out to dinner, she happily accepted and suggested a cozy Italian restaurant downtown that she loved. The day arrived and I walked a few blocks from my apartment to the restaurant with eager anticipation. The weather was unseasonably cold for early spring, but sunshine streamed between the tall buildings, lifting my spirits. I told the hostess I was meeting someone and she led me to a small table near the back. I sat down and scanned the room, expecting to see the sweet-faced girl from the dating app photos. But there was no sign of her. After 10 minutes, I started to wonder if I had been stood up. Just as I was about to give up and go home, a woman strode up to my table. She had the same petite frame as Sasha, but looked completely different. Her mousy brown hair was dyed jet black and styled in wild curls. Heavy makeup surrounded her piercing green eyes. Her lips were painted a deep red and curled into a strange smile. "You must be Alex. I'm Sasha. So nice to finally meet you," she exclaimed in a syrupy voice. I sat there stunned, unable to form a response. This woman looked nothing like the real Sasha. I considered just leaving, but she had already sat down across from me. "Sorry, I know I look really different from my pictures. I just got a makeover and wanted to surprise you," she said with a giggle. Her explanation seemed suspect, but I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just nervous for our date and trying to make a good impression. We made stilted small talk over appetizers as I kept sneaking puzzled glances at this unfamiliar woman. She seemed oblivious, prattling on about herself and asking me probing personal questions. As the meal wore on, her demeanor progressively shifted. Her voice took on a shrill, brittle edge and her questions became more intrusive. She started critiquing my appearance and making snide remarks under her breath. I started desperately looking for an escape from this bizarre situation. Our entrees arrived, but I had lost my appetite. The pasta sat untouched as an uncomfortable knot formed in my stomach. When she started berating the waitress over a minor mistake, I knew I had to flee this toxic scene. I lied about feeling suddenly ill and needing to leave. As I threw some cash on the table and stood up, her hand shot out and grabbed my wrist in a vice-like grip. Her face changed in that moment, eyes flashing with anger as she hissed, "Oh no, you're not leaving. I've been waiting far too long for this." I broke free of her grasp and rushed out in a panic. Her chilling words echoed in my mind during the agonizing walk home. Who was this unhinged stranger? What did she mean she had been waiting for this? Once safely back in my apartment, I sent Sasha a message confronting her about the date. She denied even being at the restaurant that night. Unease washed over me as I realized I had narrowly escaped someone incredibly dangerous under the guise of an innocent first date. I never heard from her again, thankfully. But the encounter left me shaken and unable to trust strangers for a long time after. Dating still fills me with trepidation, knowing that you never truly know someone until you meet face to face. And even then, darkness can lurk behind a friendly online facade. I confided in a few close friends about the traumatic experience. Their stunned reactions and concern validated how deeply disturbing it was. One friend suggested contacting the police, just to be safe, but I had no way to identify the imposter and no proof a crime was committed. Still, I took precautions like avoiding walking alone at night for a while. I also became much more cautious conversing with online matches. With time, the emotional wounds slowly healed, but it left a lasting mark on my psyche. I still find myself searching dates' faces for any deceit, ready to bolt at the slightest red flag. But I'm trying not to let one bad apple prevent me from putting myself out there. For every dangerous person wearing an innocuous mask, there are many kind and genuine people worth getting to know. Trust may come slower, but when the right person comes along, it will be worth the wait. I never thought a first date could turn into such a nightmare. It all started when I matched with Sarah on a dating app. Her profile looked promising, cute photos, similar interests, and a witty bio. We chatted for a few days and decided to meet up for drinks at a local bar. When I arrived, Sarah was already there. She looked even better in person, with a warm smile and stylish outfit. We hit it off right away, laughing and swapping stories over cocktails. She seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, asking lots of questions about my job, hobbies, and background. At first, I was flattered by all the attention, but as the night went on, I started to feel a bit uneasy. Sarah's questions were getting more and more personal, especially when it came to my finances. She wanted to know details about my salary, savings, and career aspirations. I tried to steer the conversation in other directions, but she kept circling back to money topic. Things took an even weirder turn when Sarah started gushing about this amazing business opportunity she was involved with. Apparently, it was some kind of health and wellness company that was going to revolutionize the industry. The way she described it, it sounded too good to be true. Flexible hours, unlimited earning potential, be your own boss, etc. My scam radar was starting to ping. The whole thing reeked of a multi-level marketing scheme. I politely expressed skepticism, but Sarah wouldn't take no for an answer. She kept pushing, insisting I'd be perfect for it, and I had to get in on the ground floor. When I still wasn't biting, she suggested we continue the conversation somewhere more private. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go with her to a nearby coffee shop. Big mistake. As soon as we walked in, I realized it was a setup. 3 of Sarah's business partners were waiting for us at a table. They immediately launched into a rehearsed pitch about their company, complete with a flashy PowerPoint presentation on a laptop. I felt totally ambushed and cornered. Every time I tried to make an excuse to leave, they had a counter-argument ready. They tag-teamed me with question after question, barely letting me get a word in. The pressure was intense. They kept emphasizing how this was a limited-time offer, and I'd be foolish to pass it up. At one point, they even tried to get me to sign up on the spot and hand over my credit card info. That's when I knew I had to get out of there fast. I made up an emergency and said I had to go immediately. They seemed annoyed, but finally backed off a bit. As I was gathering my things to leave, Sarah made one last desperate attempt. She grabbed my arm and quietly offered to sweeten the deal if I signed up that night, while giving me a suggestive look. I was shocked and disgusted. This whole date had been nothing but a ploy to recruit me into their pyramid scheme. I firmly told Sarah and her cronies that I wasn't interested and practically ran out of there. My heart was pounding as I speed-walked down the street, half expecting them to chase after me. Luckily, they didn't follow, but I still felt shaken up. The next day, I woke up to a barrage of messages from Sarah and the others, still trying to convince me to join their business. I blocked all their numbers and reported Sarah's profile on the dating app. Looking back, there were probably some red flags I missed early on. I guess I was blinded by Sarah's looks and charm. It was definitely one of the worst dating experiences of my life. I felt used and manipulated. What I thought was a promising romantic connection turned out to be nothing but a scam. The whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth and made me wary of online dating for a while. I ended up taking a break from dating apps after that fiasco. When I did start using them again, I was much more cautious. I paid closer attention to potential warning signs and tried to vet matches more thoroughly before meeting in person. I also made a rule to always meet in public places and have an exit strategy planned. The silver lining is that the experience taught me to trust my instincts more. If something feels off on a date, it probably is. It's okay to cut things short or leave if you're uncomfortable. Your safety and well-being should always come first. I'm glad I was able to get out of that situation without getting roped into their scheme. Some people aren't so lucky and end up losing money or getting trapped in these predatory MLMs. It's made me more aware of how these companies operate and prey on people's vulnerabilities. I've since had much better dating experiences and even met my current girlfriend through an app, but I'll never forget that disastrous first date with Sarah. It's become a crazy story I tell at parties sometimes. Most people are shocked that someone would go to such lengths just to make a sale. In the end, I learned some valuable lessons about setting boundaries, spotting red flags, and trusting my gut. While I wouldn't want to relive that night, I can appreciate how it's made me a savvier dater and more discerning person overall. I just hope Sarah and her associates eventually saw the light and got out of that toxic business. Nobody deserves to be manipulated like that, whether in dating or in work. These days, when I match with someone new, I'm much more upfront about my expectations. I make it clear I'm looking for a genuine connection, not a business opportunity. and at the first sign of any MLM talk, I'm out of there. Life's too short for bad dates and pyramid schemes. I never thought I'd end up in a cult. That's not the kind of thing you expect when you're just trying to meet someone nice for a date. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, and boy, did I get a doozy. It all started when I matched with this guy, Luke, on a dating app. His profile looked great, handsome, into meditation and spirituality, works as a life coach. We chatted for a bit, and he seemed really sweet and genuine. When he suggested meeting up for our first date at a weekend meditation retreat, I was intrigued. I'd always wanted to try something like that, and it seemed like a unique first date idea. The day of the retreat arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves and excitement. I packed an overnight bag and drove out to this remote property in the countryside. It was beautiful, all rolling hills and forests. The main building was this big old farmhouse that had been converted into a retreat center. Luke was there to greet me when I arrived. He gave me a warm hug and helped me with my bag. There were about 20 other people there for the retreat. Everyone seemed friendly enough, if a bit intense. They all wore these plain white outfits that Luke said were traditional meditation clothes. He gave me a set to change into. The first few hours weren't too bad. We did some guided meditations and breathing exercises. It was actually pretty relaxing. But then things started to get weird. The group leader, this guy they called the teacher, gave a long rambling speech about finding your true self and breaking free from society's brainwashing. He kept talking about how we were all chosen and special. I started to get an uneasy feeling in my stomach. I glanced over at Luke, hoping to catch his eye, but he was staring raptly at the teacher with this glassy-eyed expression. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just some new age retreat, it was a cult. My mind started racing, trying to figure out what. I wanted to just grab my stuff and bolt, but I was afraid of causing a scene. Plus, we were in the middle of nowhere. I didn't even know exactly where we were located. As the day went on, it only got worse. There were more speeches about letting go of your old life and devoting yourself to the work. They kept us constantly busy with activities and rituals. I realized they were using sleep deprivation and sensory overload tactics to wear us down. Luke stuck close to me the whole time, always touching my arm or putting his hand on my back. At first I thought he was being sweet, but I began to realize he was actually hurting me, making sure I didn't wander off or talk to anyone else alone. That night, we all slept in this big dormitory room. I lay awake for hours, my mind whirling. How had I gotten myself into this? How was I going to get out? I kept remembering stories I'd read about people who joined cults and never escaped. The thought of being trapped here forever made me feel sick. The next morning, I knew I had to act. They were planning to take our phones away that day as part of a digital detox. If that happened, I'd have no way to contact anyone outside. I pretended to be totally into everything, nodding and smiling. When we broke for lunch, I told Luke I wasn't feeling well and asked if I could go lie down for a bit. He seemed concerned, but agreed, telling me he'd come check on me soon. As soon as I was alone, I grabbed my phone and ran. I sprinted through the woods, stumbling over roots and branches, my heart pounding. I could hear shouting behind me. They'd realized I was gone. I finally reached the main road and flagged down a passing car. The elderly couple inside looked alarmed at my appearance, wild-eyed, still in those white cult clothes, out of breath. But they let me in when I begged them to help. I called the police from their car and reported everything. They took it seriously, thank goodness. Within a few hours, the whole place was swarming with cops. They shut down the retreat and arrested the leaders. Turns out the whole thing was even worse than I realized. They'd been operating for years, scamming people out of money and keeping them isolated from their families. Luke wasn't just some innocent victim. He was one of their main recruiters, using dating apps to lure in new members. The aftermath was rough. I had to give statements to the police and talk to lawyers. My family and friends were shocked when they found out what happened. I felt so stupid for falling for it all. But mostly, I just felt incredibly lucky that I got out when I did. It's been a few months now and I'm still processing everything. I've been seeing a therapist to work through it all. I deleted all the dating apps off my phone. I think I'll be taking a break from that scene for a while. Sometimes I still have nightmares about being trapped there. But mostly I'm just grateful. Grateful that I trusted my instincts. Grateful that I found the courage to run. And grateful that I can use my experience to help educate others about the dangers of cults and how they operate. I never expected a first date to turn into a fight for my freedom. But life is full of surprises, both good and bad. All we can do is stay alert, trust our gut, and be ready to run like hell when we need to. Last Friday was supposed to be just another first date from a dating app, but it turned into the scariest night of my life. I still can't shake the feeling that something truly sinister happened, and I'm sharing this as a warning to others who think they can trust strangers from the internet. I matched with Ryan 3 days before our date. His profile seemed normal. He worked in finance, had a golden retriever, and enjoyed hiking. We chatted briefly about our favorite local restaurants before agreeing to meet at the Corner Bistro, a small place downtown that had good reviews. I arrived a few minutes early and waited at the bar. When Ryan walked in at 7 p.m., everything seemed fine. He was tall, well-dressed, and looked exactly like his profile pictures, which was actually a relief. We were seated at a cozy table near the window, and the waitress brought us water while we looked over the menus. The first 30 minutes were completely normal. We talked about our jobs, and he told me about growing up in Seattle before moving here for work. He seemed charming and well-spoken, making eye contact and asking thoughtful questions about my career in graphic design. I remember thinking how refreshing it was to have a date going so smoothly. That's when things started getting weird. I noticed Ryan's attention kept drifting to something behind me. At first, it was just quick glances, but they became more frequent and longer. His hand started trembling slightly when he reached for his water glass, and he kept checking his phone under the table. The shift in his behavior was so sudden it made me nervous. He suggested we switch seats, and something about the way he asked, the tension in his voice, the slight shake in his hands, made my stomach turn. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to see what had him so spooked. After we switched, I understood why he'd been acting strange. There was someone standing near the entrance, partially hidden behind a large decorative plant. The figure was tall and wearing dark clothes, but I couldn't make out any features. It was like looking at a shadow that had taken human form. The longer I looked, the more unsettled I felt. Ryan's behavior deteriorated quickly after that. He barely touched his mushroom risotto, which he'd been excited about ordering earlier. His responses to my questions became short and distracted. He kept typing on his phone, his fingers moving frantically across the screen. I tried to peek at what he was writing, but he kept the phone angled away from me. The restaurant's lighting started acting strange. First one flicker, then another. Each time the lights dimmed, I swear the dark figure moved closer to our table. By the third flicker, it was standing just a few tables away. Ryan's face had lost all color, and his forehead was covered in sweat despite the restaurant's cool temperature. Without warning, Ryan threw some cash on the table and grabbed his jacket. He reached for my arm, pulling me up from my seat with surprising strength. Instead of heading toward the main entrance where the figure stood, he dragged me toward the kitchen. We burst through the swinging doors, past confused kitchen staff who barely had time to react. The back door led to a narrow alley, and the cold night air hit me like a slap. That's when reality caught up with me. I was alone in a dark alley with a man I'd known for less than an hour, running from something he refused to explain. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears I could barely think straight. We reached the parking lot, and Ryan kept looking over his shoulder, muttering something that made my skin crawl. He said this always happens, like it was some kind of routine for him. Those words triggered every survival instinct I had. Who was this man really, and what kind of trouble followed him so persistently that he considered it normal? I managed to wrench my arm free from his grip and practically dove into my car, immediately hitting the lock button. Through my rearview mirror, I could see the dark figure standing at the alley entrance. Ryan stood between my car and the figure, his hands pressed against my window, begging me to let him in. The three of us formed a bizarre tableau, me in my locked car, Ryan frozen in panic, and the mysterious figure watching from the shadows. Without thinking twice, I started the engine and drove away as fast as I could. In my mirrors, I watched Ryan's figure grow smaller, and I swear I saw the dark shape move toward him just as I turned the corner. Part of me feels guilty for leaving him there, but a stronger part knows I made the right choice. The drive home was nerve-wracking. I took random turns through residential areas, doubled back several times, and even drove past my house once to make sure no one was following me. Every shadow and every car behind me seemed threatening. I kept expecting to see that dark figure materialize in my back. Once home, I locked every door and window, then sat in my brightest room until sunrise. I blocked Ryan's number and deleted the dating app. I spent hours searching online for any information about him, but his entire digital presence had vanished. His dating profile, which I'd taken screenshots of earlier that week, led to an error page. The next day, I went back to the Corner Bistro to ask about their security cameras. The manager seemed confused when I described what happened, claiming they had no record of any disturbance. When they showed me the footage from the previous night, our table appeared empty. The camera had caught me walking in alone, sitting at a table by myself for a few minutes, then suddenly rushing out through the kitchen. Ryan wasn't there. The dark figure wasn't there. Nothing matched my memories. It's been a week now, and I still can't explain what happened that night. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I find bruises on my arm where Ryan grabbed me. They're real, just like my fear was. The strangest part came yesterday when I drove past the corner bistro again. The windows were covered with brown paper, and a for lease sign hung in the window. When I asked neighboring businesses about it, they all said the restaurant had been closed for months after a fire. But I know I was just there last Friday. I have the receipt in my purse to prove it, though the ink has faded so much it's barely readable now. I still don't go out after dark anymore, and I've sworn off dating apps completely. Sometimes when I'm alone, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that dark figure standing there. Every phone notification makes me jump, and I've started taking different routes to work each day, just in case. I don't know if Ryan was the victim or part of something larger. I don't know if he's even real anymore, but I know what I saw that night, even if the security cameras tell a different story. Some questions are better left unanswered, and some first dates should definitely be last dates. If you're reading this and planning to meet someone from a dating app, please be careful. Sometimes the real danger isn't in what you can see, but in what you can't explain. I really wish I hadn't gone on that Tinder date last night. The whole thing started normally enough. We matched a few days ago, and after some basic chatting, agreed to meet at this nice Italian place downtown. His profile seemed normal, just a guy named Mark who worked in finance. My friends always tell me to be careful with online dating, but I'd been on plenty of normal dates before. This one felt different from the start, though. When I got to the restaurant, I spotted him right away at a corner table. He looked just like his photos. Tall, dark hair, well-dressed. The first thing that caught my eye was this intricate necklace he was wearing. It had this small pendant that looked handcrafted, though I couldn't make out the details from where I stood. I remember thinking it was unusual for a guy in finance to wear such an artistic piece of jewelry. Throughout dinner, something felt off. Every time I tried asking about his background, family, or work, he'd give these really vague answers before quickly changing the subject. He kept fidgeting with that necklace too, almost like a nervous habit. I tried to keep the conversation light, but there was this weird tension I couldn't shake. When I asked where he grew up, he just said, around. When I mentioned my own family, he barely seemed interested. About halfway through our meal, I got a better look at his necklace when he leaned forward to take a bite. The pendant was maybe an inch long, carved from what looked like ivory or bone. There was definitely a face sculpted into it, but the lighting made it hard to see clearly. I kept trying to get a better look without being obvious about it. Something about it just drew my attention. My stomach started feeling weird when I realized he kept staring at my face whenever he thought I wasn't looking. Not in a flattering way, more like he was studying me. I caught him several times comparing my face to something in his hand under the table. Each time, he'd quickly put his hand back up when he noticed me watching. The way he looked at me made my skin crawl, like I was being sized up for something. The worst part came when I complimented his necklace, trying to break the awkward silence. His whole demeanor changed. His shoulders tensed up, and his face went completely blank. He mumbled something about it being a family heirloom and gripped it tightly. After that, he barely spoke 2 words to me. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd touched on something I shouldn't have. I made an excuse about feeling sick and needed to leave early. As I stood up to go, I got my closest look at the pendant yet. My blood ran cold. The tiny carved face was feminine, with delicate features that looked eerily familiar. The nose, the shape of the eyes, even the slight tilt of the head. It was like looking at a miniature version of my own face. I tried telling myself it was just my imagination, but the resemblance was undeniable. What really freaked me out was realizing the carving looked aged, like it had been made years ago. But it was unmistakably my face. I practically ran out of the restaurant, and I swear I could feel his eyes on me the whole way to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my key in the ignition. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I got home, I immediately blocked him on Tinder and all social media. I spent hours searching online for anything about carved face pendants or similar stories, but found nothing helpful, just a bunch of generic jewelry sites and art pieces. I even tried searching missing persons cases in my area, but that just led me down a scary rabbit hole that kept me up most of the night. This morning, I tried convincing myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe the face didn't look as much like me as I thought. Maybe the weird lighting and awkward date vibes just got to me. But then I checked my mail and found a small package with no return address. My heart nearly stopped when I saw it. Inside was a delicate wood carving tool, wrapped in a piece of yellowed paper. The paper had dates written on it, dozens of them, going back almost 30 years. The last date listed was yesterday. Some of the dates had tiny marks next to them, like check marks. Others had been crossed out. Mine was circled. I haven't left my apartment today. I keep thinking about how many other necklaces he might have and how many dates are on that list. Every time I close my eyes, I see that tiny carved face staring back at me. I don't know what to do. The police would probably think I'm crazy. I mean, a creepy necklace isn't exactly a crime. And what would I even say? That my bad date had jewelry that looked like me? I keep checking my windows and doors, making sure they're locked. I deleted all my dating apps and made all my social media private. I know it probably sounds like I'm overreacting, but something about that necklace and those dates feels deeply wrong. Sometimes I think I spot someone watching my building from across the street, but when I look again, they're gone. I've started keeping all my curtains closed. My friends think I'm being dramatic about a bad date, but they didn't see that necklace. They didn't see the way he looked at me, or feel that cold dread when I realized what the carving looked like. They haven't seen the list of dates either. I'm too scared to show anyone, worried it might somehow make things worse. The worst part is not knowing if I imagined the whole thing, or if I narrowly escaped something terrible. Either way, I don't think I'll be going on any first dates for a while. I can't stop wondering about those other dates on the list, about whether there are other necklaces out there with other faces. Every time my phone buzzes or I hear a noise outside, my heart stops for a second. I know I should probably report this to someone, but who would believe me? For now, I'm just trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, even though deep down I know it wasn't.